Hello, good evening, welcome. My name is Nikolaus Hirsch, co-editor of e-flux architecture, and it's a great pleasure to have you all here and to present dimensions of citizenship, which is the topic of this year's US Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. And I think it's a great opportunity to have here the two of the three curators, Mimi Zeiger and Anne Louis, and a number of contributors who will speak about their take on this question of citizenship within the current economic and political context on a global arena, but certainly also with a certain focus on the US. And we are really happy to have here Ingrid Burrington, Kalle Easterling, Shannon Harway, Suk-Yong Hong, Laura Kurgan, and Enrique Ramirez. Liz Diller couldn't make it, unfortunately, but since she's doing a really amazing project together with Laura Kurgan, I think we'll have a pretty good insight into this. And we're also really happy to collaborate as e-flux architecture together with you on this project, since we will publish a series of essays actually around the Biennale, even starting before the opening, which is quite exciting also, I think, to start a discussion even before the opening. And I think I'll leave it to that because we have, I guess, quite a lot of content tonight. So let's give a warm welcome to Mimi and Anne.
Thank you, Nicholas. Can you hear me all right? Sure. We've been sharing all day.
Anne and Mimi show.
Yes, we've gotten pretty good at this. It's really quite wonderful to be here tonight, to see so many friends and brilliant people here in the audience, and to be able to share these ideas which have been brewing fairly and sort of behind curtains for a little bit, and begin to sort of let them out into the public. Yes, we are Dimensions of Citizenship, the US Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. We're also excited to be joined here by two of our commissioning institutions, the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute Chicago. And we are sort of representing, and even though I'm from LA, a kind of Chicago presence here in New York. But we're talking about changing ideas of citizenship, so maybe sort of even urban identity is becoming a little bit more shifty in the process. I'm going to give just a very brief overview about what we mean by dimensions of citizenship. Anne will fill some of that in. We'll kick it back and forth. But mostly, we want to leave room for each of the participants to say a kind of position around citizenship. And then have a conversation around that. So I will keep it short. One of the main things that I think is important to sort of situate here is that Dimensions of Citizenship comes at a moment when headlines here in the States and abroad ask us to really reconsider who has full access to the full rights of citizenship and who doesn't. And when we look at this, we also think about this as an element of the built environment, that we're seeing sort of actions around citizenship and around sort of who gets to occupy space play out on public streets, in airports, at border walls. I keep saying, and at prototypes as well. It seems like every time you turn on the news, there is some sort of issue that is sort of conflating architecture and this question about citizenship. And yet, without sort of beating on the nationalist or sort of the idea of sovereignty, how can we sort of begin to use design, to use architecture to make a provocation around citizenship and how we can engage? I think there's a real responsibility for architecture to have not only be sort of implicit in and even embodied in these issues, but actually sort of as an agent to speculate and even envision sort of new considerations and even maybe more equitable situations as we deal with questions of migration, housing equity, or even nationalism. So with those few remarks, let me turn it over to Anne, who's going to fill in with a little bit about the structure of the exhibition.
Thank you, Mimi, and thank you all for coming here. I think from the beginning, we've always thought that this dive into citizenship wouldn't be encyclopedic. It wouldn't attempt to kind of cover all the ground, but instead, we've introduced a curatorial framework that's inspired by the Eames Powers of 10 as a way to kind of structure deep dives into certain case studies and what it means to be a citizen today. And I think so we've organized this exhibition around 7 scales and 7 commission participants who will be in the U.S. Pavilion. And in a way, I think that is in part a critical project in the sense that nation becomes one of these scales, but this project also starts to ask what it means not just to belong at the scale of a nation, but also in a neighborhood, in a voting district, in a watershed. So overall, we've introduced 7 scales. They are citizen, civitas, region, nation, globe, network, cosmos. And I'm just going to run through these quickly. Some of our participants are here today, so I want to let them kind of dive into their works a little more deeply. But I think giving you the overview of the kind of works that are being investigated and looked into in the pavilion will give a framework to this conversation. At the scale of the citizen, the first scale, we've commissioned work by Amanda Williams and Andres L. Hernandez in collaboration with Shawnee Crow. Their work investigates the idea that Black women's space matters. Their work in the courtyard is made of steel and hand-braided cord, and it's inspired by historical figures like Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Tubman. Studio Gang's work for the Biennale at the scale of Civitas looks into their work about asking what it means to make a civic monument today in the city of Memphis, which, like many American cities, is reckoning with histories of slavery and also of inequality. At the scale of the region, Scape Landscape Architecture here from New York is talking about what it means to be an ecological citizen. They're using the Venice rapid wetland loss as a kind of moment to ask what the role individual people can play in protecting and restoring landscapes at risk. At the scale of the nation, we have a studio, Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman, who have been working in the border region for decades and know this area incredibly well. And I think they challenge us to think of the border not just as a line, but as a region. At the scale of the globe, Laura Kurgan is here, so I'll let her speak to this content a little bit more in depth. At the scale of the network, Keller Easterling too, I will not give away too much here. Design Earth is working at the scale of the cosmos with a kind of science fiction investigation of architecture, talking about the kind of possible futures as looking at current conditions of privatized space exploration and climate instability here on Earth. And so I'll hand it back to Mimi to talk more about some of the kind of corollary parts of this exhibition and the way that these 7 commission works kind of speak in relationship to a few other mediums that we've commissioned and that we're excited about for the pavilion.
Thanks, Anne. I think one of the secondary pieces of the exhibition is something we're calling the Transit Screening Lounge, which takes its name from a play on the transit lounge, which you find in airports when you're sort of transferring in between international spaces without kind of crossing through borders. It's sort of a no man's land, a liminal space. And we're looking at these liminal spaces because, as you can tell, the scales are sort of dogmatic in their sort of parsing out of certain sort of territories. The Transit Screening Lounge is meant to sort of capture the migratory, blurry edges, even the transgressions that happen. One of the inspirations around it is Wendy Brown and her work around borders and border walls, and how the minute that you build a wall, you also build the opposite of the wall, the informal sort of reactions to the wall. So those films, without naming all of them, are extremely narrative and poetic, cinematic in scope, sometimes even nonlinear. It sort of goes against narrative, but you get my point. And again, we're trying to sort of capture the other ways of belonging, those ones that aren't quite so simple or easy to encapsulate within a scalar version. We are also extremely excited by this editorial partnership with e-flux architecture and the ultimately 12 essays that will be coming out from many of the participants here tonight, some of which have written their essays and we've read them and we are completely in love, and some to come. Our rapid responders will be responding in relatively real time to both the questions of the Pavilion, but also to the questions of what's going on in the world. It seemed difficult to set in stone a deadline for a catalog and then not be, the way that the world keeps rolling past us. In addition to that, dimensionsofcitizenship.org, which, like the Pavilion exhibition and the catalog, is designed by Infoco. It will host something we're calling the NX100, which is a series of what we're hoping to be viral responses around citizenship, drawn from a bunch of participants, almost 100, to submit some statements and images around that. And then lastly, during Vernissage and over the course of the Biennale, we'll be curating 2 different programming events, which are sure to be participatory and exciting. Citizen Lab, which is for workshops and performances in the US Pavilion Courtyard, and Citizenship, a whole series of engaged offsite events in and around Venice, which has been extremely exciting and is being cooked up by our co-curator, Neil Atkinson, who cannot be here today. And with that, I should also say that our website and many other kind of parts of the exhibition are being worked on by Iker Gill, who also cannot be here today, but all of these conversations are sort of been very collaborative and fruitful. So I think that with that, I think we'd like to invite all our participants up on stage all at once. And then we will do a quick 5 minutes each. I know it seems like it's going to be painful to sit up here and do your 5 minutes, but I think it's the only way that we're actually going to get a cross conversation going ultimately. So please come take a chair. We may have to push this back a little bit. Good, without anyone falling off. There we go.
Yeah, I feel like
Are we all there? All right, we're all here. I'd like Shannon Harvey with Infoco to be our first presenter.
Thanks, Mimi and Anne. Thanks, everyone. My name's Shannon Harvey. I'm from design studio Inventory, Form, and Content, or Infoco for short. We've formerly worked, my partner Adam and Michaels and I, as projects, and we just founded a new studio in Los Angeles. So I've been asked to talk about a definition of citizenship through the lens of the graphic design and exhibition design for the US Pavilion. So this graphic that you see on stage here, it started from this idea of citizenship as a fluid construct. So many borders for some and fewer borders for many. The graphic attempts to capture this kind of duality to provide a sense of distinction, but also acknowledge the many ways that the zones intersect, overlap, and bleed into each other. There's also a kind of play with the way that one's perspective can shift depending on how something is presented. So this shape is a 15-sided polygon that, when viewed from a distance, looks like a simple circle. But when you get up close, there is a kind of complexity to the edge condition. And the polygon stems from, of course, a geodesic framework. And working through the different kinds of ambiguity, we found this sort of triangle of the geodesic framework also gave a sense of kind of 2D and 3D overlapping and kind of flipping between the two modes. Within this spaceship Earth, there are a wide array of different patterns. They're combined in different ways in different media, so across the website, the exhibition, and the book. And the resulting graphic language is both defined, but also not reductive. The patterns are also couched in these kind of lines, these horizontal lines that speak to a kind of bureaucratic process of citizenship. So just to add a few last words about the exhibition design itself, the polygon will play a role. There's also a kind of framework in the design overall that's meant to enable the kind of unique characteristics of each installation, and there'll be some kind of subtle shifts throughout the space. We're also thrilled to be designing and publishing through Inventory Press the catalog for the exhibition, which is going to be a kind of small paperback format, designed to be both widely accessible, readily available, and easy to read on the bus, the subway, or maybe even the Vaporetto. Thanks.
All right, with that, I think we're turning it to Keller. Is that?
Yes, hi. I'm Keller Easterling, and I'm at the network scale of the formulation. And this is a project done by me and with a group called Many. It's a project called Many, done by Many. One person in Many is here tonight, Neil Donnelly. But Many is an online platform that facilitates migration through an exchange of needs. The global infrastructure space that I study has sort of perfectly streamlined the movement of billions of goods and tens of millions of tourists and cheap laborers, but at a time when over 65 million people in the world are displaced, somehow there's still so few ways to handle political, economic, or environmental migrations. The nation state has a kind of dumb on-off button for granting or denying citizenship or asylum, and the NGocracy, offers as its best idea kind of storage in a refugee camp that's a detention lasting on average 17 years. So Many's asking, can the legal and logistical ingenuity that lubricates trade be applied to a global form of matchmaking between all those sideline talents of migrating populations and a multitude of other opportunities around the world? So Many is deliberately positioned a little bit away from the sharp end of migration emergencies, but the visa games are ugly and fraught, and this is not a sunny one world sharing economy. Instead, it's just an attempt to overcome a bunch of dumb obstructions with the persistence of resourceful people. So Many tries to outwit right-wing opposition to migration by just more robustly networking short-term visas and cooperative exchanges for those who want to resettle, but also for those who want to keep traveling, who never wanted this citizenship that the nation withholds or finally reluctantly bestows. So it's trying to connect some existing visa sponsorships with spatial projects. So, imagining how cities can bargain with their underexploited spaces to attract talent and resources, matching their needs with the needs of mobile people to generate mobile benefits, mutual benefits. So there's no haves and have-nots. It's just needs. And problems are the raw assets that are linked in these non-market exchanges. It's imagining that there are groups on either side of an exchange that form a kind of no-tech blockchain, and maybe you can see sort of beyond national identity, these group-to-group relationships share their own visual language and ways of engendering trust. And in addition to displaying a kind of broader array of opportunities, maybe eventually Many, which we're coding right now, might also encourage immigration laws that focus not on exclusion, but on on authorizing multiple visa strings that can qualify for internationally recognized accreditation and for education for dependents. I mean, it's worth noting that if the most well-rehearsed short-term visa journeys involve education, now there's so many more work and research networks that are just focused on climate migration and the state of the planet. It's just one of the things we've discovered. So finally, as we're developing it over multiple iterations, and you only see one at the Biennale, it's hoping to kind of alter habits, reduce some of the violence around migration, and ask, might another kind of cosmopolitan mobility organize around intervals of time or seasons of life to form a branching set of options that's more practical and more politically agile? And I mean, also one thing that concerns me, can this platform guard against the very things and dangers it critiques? And might this exchange be anticipated and celebrated as a means to global citizenship credentials, but certainly rejecting the characterization of migration as crisis? It's asserting the reality of migration as constant.
Laura, you want to take it from here?
Hi there, I'm Laura Kurgan, and I'm representing, as Nicholas said, a much larger team of Liz Diller and Bobby Pietrusco, who also couldn't be here tonight, although he's in New York, and also the Center for Spatial Research, which I direct. So we've been given the global scale as a dimension of citizenship. And you're going to see these three images, which is only the bare beginnings of what we're trying to do. So for our work, we've deployed two data sets. One is from NASA's Suomi satellite, which takes a picture of the Earth every day at 1 a.m. in the morning, which is commonly known as the night lights data set. And an image data set called the gridded population of the world, which assembles censuses taken by governments around the world in an average and not such predictable ways. So the black marble is usually seen as an image of connectivity, the energy-connected globe. Light here is seen as a proxy for settlement, economic activity, and human activity. The gridded population of the world shows uneven ways in which governments count people, and to put it another way, make people count, which is not often so obvious. So in some countries, the data can be resolved to a definite number of people, represented by a single 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer pixels, where in other countries, a number can be resolved only to a 50 kilometer by 50 kilometer pixel. So for storytelling purposes, we compared these two data sets, beginning with a hunch, that there are locations in the world where anomalies would occur between the data sets, places in the world where there are a lot of people and no lights, and places in the world where there are a lot of light and no people. When we subtracted these two data sets, we found out that there are 16,000 such anomalies globally. So to tell specific stories, we are beginning to filter the data. For example, when you look at these points and filter them by national borders, the 5 most luminous countries compared to the size of its population are Oman, Saudi Arabia, Finland, United States, and Norway. The 5 least luminous countries compared to its population size are Haiti, surprisingly, Somaliland, Chad, Ethiopia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this list, sort of goes on for the whole 200 list of countries in the world. So we'll tell stories by applying more creative filters to these 16,000 points. The condition of anomalies which show people and no lights is often called energy poverty. Places in the world which have no refrigeration, no light at night for homework, and use fire instead of electricity for cooking, which is extremely unhealthy indoors. We are still in the process of selecting specific stories for this condition, but often in these conditions, many people are marginalized for multiple reasons, from governments prioritizing electricity for other populations, or because of migrations or recent disasters, such as the current conditions in Puerto Rico, where electricity has still not been completely restored after these many months. There are also many anomalies which show lights and no people. So that's the kind of standard way that the night lights are used. So now for the non-standard ways, there are many anomalies which show lights, no people. We'll focus, for example, on the 504 points in exclusive economic zones, a 300-mile area off the coast of any country where that country has the right to profit from extractions, like oil and fish. There are many oil drilling sites in the zone, and we're in the process of focusing on 2 such locations. Populations in these zones are often not counted by censuses because they are marginal and transient workers. But also other kinds of points in these zones are tourist sites where there are lights and no people because tourists aren't counted as citizens of any country. So there's a broad variety of kinds of sites that'll be in that story. So the third story will focus on the 16,000 points using the points to show lights and no people in close proximity to urban areas which show points with people and no light. So one such condition is the Katanga copper belt in southeastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. The most luminous point, which shows lights, no people, turned out to be the Kowezi copper mine. It is electrified via the 2 dams and joined to each other by a high voltage DC transmission line that spans 1,700 kilometers and links the 2 dams to the Bas-Congo, a distant coastal province in the West DRC. Along this line, many anomalies appear, big cities showing no light at 1:15 a.m. in the morning. Here, government prioritizes electricity delivery to the mines, while many cities, including Kinshasa, Kikwit, and Kanangwa, and others, receive uneven electricity on a daily basis. The story is much more complex, but these are the broad strokes. So keep in mind as well, and Keller would know this very well, that the night lights picture is taken at 1 a.m. in the morning at any point on Earth. So the picture of the light is one of infrastructure rather than residential light. Most people are asleep at that time of day. Nevertheless, light infrastructure points to electricity delivery in cities. The installation will show a number of zooms showing the relationships between these 2 data sets, zooming in and out thematically around these 16,000 points. Meanwhile, on the right screen, an image of daytime blue marble will respond to this navigation, showing ground evidence of the abstract data on the left wall, and will zoom in through a series of the same viewports onto higher and higher resolution imagery. So data, evidence.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for coming. It's a non-zero number of people in this audience. I'm kind of pleased that I'm the only person who's shown a photograph so far. I was invited to write about the network citizenship theme for the catalog, and I'm not going to really be talking about exactly what I wrote about for the essay, but hopefully there's some resonance with, I think one of the things that I love, Keller, about your project, and that I think is kind of an interesting aspect of thinking about citizenship within a networked space, is that often the citizen is left to kind of glean at the edges of the larger system and find creative kind of interloper ways to navigate it. So this is a picture of a utility marking, and I apologize in advance if I'm over-explaining a very familiar thing to most of this audience, but these are markings that kind of aren't there for the general public, right? They're applied in advance of street excavation, basically to sort of prevent damage to existing buried infrastructure. So the typical reader of this text, of the street as you will, is other utility workers and people doing construction. But they are in a way written for the public, right? Insofar as they're a public service, right? They are a marking that's made, so a utility worker doesn't cut into a fiber line or a gas main, and nothing terrible breaks, and nobody knows and nobody thanks the person who did that work. And I became really fascinated with these markings a few years ago when I learned that no one would just give me a map of all of the fiber optic cable routes in New York City. And they're a kind of weird, patchy way to start to reverse engineer bits and pieces of the network and at least kind of get some grounding when you're looking in an intersection in New York City of just the enormity and complexity of the infrastructure in the built environment. I took the citizenship and the built environment thing really literally when asked for an image for this. And I think so I wrote a book basically decoding all of these types of markings and the different companies that kind of are involved. It's not important. But I think there is one of the things that drew me to kind of talking more about the material infrastructure of the internet is that I think the visual vernacular is often limited. And I think that the network citizenship or the experience of it is often kind of one of trying and failing to keep track of things like this, of the sort of myriad of networks that operate in the same space, but then are kind of flattened and abstracted into a single pane, maybe of a web page, the same way that, these networks are collapsed into layers of spray paint that if you're actually a responsible New Yorker, you're not staring at when you cross the street. I think, but where I guess the imperfect metaphor extends is this idea of hints of these larger kinds of systems through which you operate, the uncertainty of kind of not knowing what borders one's data is crossing, what entities that it's beholden to, what transactions or terms of service you may or may not have committed yourself that you did not actually read, is that often there's sort of like hints of them hidden in plain sight. It's a matter of kind of learning how to pay attention for and learning where to look for them. It's like kind of getting embedded in the legalese of terms of service that were not in fact written for you, or looking for those JavaScript files in the background that, for now you can still access with the inspect element tool, which is, still imperfect insofar as I think learning to see the thing hidden in plain sight is not a particularly optimistic outcome. I'm not really a big fan of the assumption that transparency and improving public understanding inevitably improves the body politic, but I do like the idea of these images, of these sorts of markings, as thinking of them and thinking by extension of the different kinds of cracks and gleans that you can find in a network system more as actually a public safety concern. I'm terrified of this entire room of people, so I think I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks.
I think it kicks over to you, Enrique.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be amongst these people. I'm warning you, I'm going to show some images that I'm not supposed to be showing. These are from the Thomas Pynchon archive at the Harry Ransom Center. For this discussion about, by the way, I'm one of the rapid responders. I should be clear about my role in this whole event. So for this discussion about dimensions of citizenship, I want to show you something I found in Pynchon's archive at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas this past summer. It's a letter dated 23 November 1962, written in Mexico City and addressed to Pynchon's editor at Lippincott, Faith Sale. I don't know all the facts to the story, but I can tell you something about what may be going on here and how this may relate to dimensions of citizenship just by looking at these objects. It is a year after Pynchon has published his first novel, V, and he's in the middle of editorial revisions for the paperback edition. He's also working on 2 other manuscripts. The first is his next novel, The Crying of Lot 49, which will be published in 1966, and the other is a short story called The Secret Integration, which will be published in 1964. So Pynchon is in a self-imposed creative exile and is having a bit of a self-identity crisis, and paranoid type that he is, worries that he will be sued for libel. And why is that? As he writes in this letter, which you can't really see here, but I'll just read it out loud. But tonight, listening to Juan Lopez Montezuma's show, recorded jazz on my faithful transistor, I am informed that Thelonious Monk's middle name is Sphere. There's also a character in V named Sphere, also a jazz musician, although he blows in alto, not piano, and his name was chosen because a sphere is a non-square in 3 dimensions. What I wonder is there likely to be trouble of a legal sort because of this similarity in names? If so, we will just have to change his name, is all. Now, I bring this to our discussion because of all things, a sphere is discussed, a putative object of our inquiry here. But it's also a space of interconnectivity and discourse, of building and designing that is invoked here. For this is a letter written by a novelist who has just hightailed it away from Seattle and is listening to Monk and reading Borges in Mexico City. It's a letter addressed not to his editor, but to a forwarding address in New York, from which said letter will be sent by courier to Ghana, where Sale is living with her husband, Kirkpatrick Sale, who just happens to be writing a book called The Land and People of Ghana. Ghana, of course, is the first African nation to win independence in the 20th century. This is, after all, an artifact, proof of an author negotiating the contours of his own location in the world with an editor and author documenting the arrival of a new world. This is proof of an author dislocated in space and time, working at a distance. It speaks of our contemporary condition, not just me as a historian and writer, and not just of the curators and participants here, whose work takes them all over the world. We all work at a distance, an idea that conjures what the literature theorist and critic Franco Moretti calls distant reading. Distant reading is a way of engaging literature by not reading. That is, it involves processing data and metadata about a book, for example, themes, subjects, persons, places, publications, dates, etc., to detect general trends about the total history of world literature, one that abandons looking at a small number of canonical texts in favor of a total, all-encompassing view of literature. So when translating this idea to architecture, to the way it operates in the world, to the way it conjures dimensions of citizenship, I kept thinking about the envelope that contained Pynchon's letter, which you see here above. Like I said, it was sent to a forwarding address in New York, a transit point somewhere between Mexico City and Ghana. And yet the envelope is something with implications for writing, for architecture, as well as writing about architecture. There is, of course, the architectural envelope, which separates outside from in. But lest we think of the envelope as something that separates, an idea that I think is anathema to what this pavilion is all about, and rather think of the way that an envelope, not just the one addressed by Pynchon, the way an envelope connects, then I will end with a quote from the introduction to Anne-Marie Chandler's and Nori Neumark's Survey of Pre-Internet Art and Activism, a book which is not only called At a Distance, but that invokes, of all things, envelopes. Envelopes, write Chandler and Neumark, are material objects that straddle communications and art, that relay between artists and activists at a distance. And it is distance that gives them their intensity and energy rather than being erased by their movement. As containers, envelopes fold outside into inside, public into private. They are an effective and material point of contact, part closing and barrier, part opening, a site at which the public and private fold into one another. They hold out promise and uncertainty, stuffed full with rich artistic, cultural, emotional, and economic history. Envelopes are also part of the everyday that we take for granted. The sort of taking for granted that most art at a distance would disrupt. Envelopes also map distance in ways that reflect creative media discourse and individual subjectivities. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Seok-Jung Hong, and I'm a writer and a web editor at the Architects newspaper. I wanted to, I guess, first of all, situate ourselves in the reality that tomorrow Trump visits the prototypes in San Diego of the U.S. border wall. And I guess as a journalist, it's very hard to avoid the constant stream of stories that really reveal the dimensions of citizenship right now in the U.S., which is a division between a good immigrant and a bad immigrant. And at the same time, though, I think this photo and what I'm going to speak about is hoping to not cede citizenship to the state and to simply talk about the formal and legal position of citizenship, which is, I think, what a lot of people here already did. But I wanted to talk about this kind of idea of insurgent citizenship. I think it's very familiar to many, but the example that comes to mind is the Western Cape anti-eviction campaign in South Africa. And they formed in 2000 in the post-apartheid government, when the government had promised various political and formal rights, especially the redistribution of land and housing, and instead most people found themselves worse off in reality. And so the campaign was very militant and very direct and very organized around actually seizing back land, blocking evictions, reconnecting water and electricity, and so on. And in 2009, at the height of the foreclosure crisis in the United States, so this is 9 years after they formed, they wrote a letter to poor Americans, and they specifically addressed it to poor Americans in solidarity, and they said, this is how they defined their work. They said, we take action to get land and houses, and also to prevent banks from stealing our land and houses. When a family gets evicted and has nowhere to go, we put them back inside. When government cuts off our electricity, we put it back on. We break the government's law in order not to break our own moral laws. We oppose the authorities because we never gave them the authority to steal, buy, and sell our land in the first place. And this person here is actually in Boston, protesting the American Banking Association's conference. And so I think this idea of insurgent citizenship is essentially arguing that citizenship is a practice situated in the everyday that doesn't necessarily settle for the formal avenues of citizenship, but really fights for the actual political, economic, and social rights that one asserts their right to have. So just simply the right to have rights, and then to actually substantially realize them. And I think I just juxtapose this with the kind of frequent conversation I have with architects around things like designing the border wall. And what many often argue is that architects will bring a humane design solution to something like the border wall, or to something like a detention center. And I think in theory, or just on the very superficial face of it, something like humane design and citizens' campaign to reconnect water, they look like they have the same goal, which is to have access to decent shelter or decent conditions. But it's really the process and the relationship to power that differentiates them. And I think that in thinking about the dimension of citizenship as an active practice, the thing that I hope is to stop having this conversation where humane design is somehow the apex of what is like the absolute, somehow the ultimate achievement of what an architect can do under these conditions, when in fact we can, shift the window or shift the framework. And it actually is a great opportunity at this time to do so, because everything feels like it's being questioned. And I think I just want to stress that activist citizenship is not always a militant civil direct action. It's not always protesting, but it's very much, as in the case of Western Cape and these organizations, it's about being flexible and responding to people's everyday needs, and the tactics differ every day in every situation. So that's one thing.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks everyone. My name is Nick Axel from e-flux Architecture. So I'm gonna try and weave a conversation on top of the one that's already been taking place, because I was I was really quite stunned at a lot of the continuities and a lot of the similarities. Not similarities, but I kept going back and reflecting on these panels to this question that Laura was dealing with, kind of what happens in between the resolution standards, and how this it becomes a question of of almost creating new forms of invisibility from within the cracks. So not necessarily about hiding yourself and not necessarily representation, but finding new forms. And I think that this speaks very much to this thing that Sunjuk was saying about of trying to reposition activism that it's what one form is going out into the streets, of course, but then there's also kind of an increasing need to find new forms and new ways and new techniques of addressing and advocating for individual needs. And I think that this is something that I was quite drawn to and has been quite central to I think an understanding of citizenship today, is that citizenship is not a single right. I mean, it is a bundle. To use the legal term, which I understand has its own problems, I think that there is a question of what happens when we start. While there is such a need and there is such an urgency for so many people to fight for citizenship as this category, also what happens when we break it down to specific resources, to specific needs. So I think that this is a. So I don't know. I'm maybe trying to open up a space of dialogue between Keller and Sunjuk here, because I think that there's a certain degree of attention and care placed on the everyday, but through radically different at least images. But I think under behind the image there's a very strong affinity between the two. So I was wondering if I don't know which person I should give this mic to, but I was hoping that one of you may be able to respond to the other's presentation, kind of maybe factored through their own.
Intercede very quickly, because I wrote a version of this question in a cheesy way that I just want to say and see if it's the same question you're asking.
Oh, it's just one sentence. I think the question is, can you be an insurgent for the citizenship of loopholes? That's all.
Well, I did also respond to your talk, because when in an experimental studio we were beginning to work on issues of migration, the first assumption, was that that's what we were going to do, that we were going to fix up the tent, and that we were going to accept some kind of downstream assignment within a bad idea, that would be furthering the violence of this kind of singular solution for migration, when there can only be 65 million responses and no solutions. So it was a studio that was looking at how spatial variables might be more prominent and have more authority in global governance over many of the things that we already give authority to, like laws and standards and econometrics. And so it was almost how much we uncovered about why those spatial variables might matter as a kind of workaround for resourceful people who, again, I'll say it again, who don't want your stupid citizenship, they didn't want it. They just want another kind of cosmopolitan mobility.
I think for me, I also really appreciate this. I guess it's like a very visible and extremely. I don't know what the word is. It's not mechanical, but it feels like a very rich system for acknowledging the different statuses and aspirations of actual people. So it's very different from what we currently seem to have. And I mean, I think that when it comes to challenging whether or not people want a certain type of legal citizenship or whether they want to have mobility, I think that the key is actually about this question of people knowing what they want and building these kinds of systems that are not, basically about jumping through 1,000 loopholes to prove that you're good enough to belong and so on. And I think that that's very much the model that we have here and that many places also have, which is that you can never be insurgent, you always have to be obedient. And I think that an idea of a visa system that actually looks at skill or that looks at history, the history of an actual person is kind of, it's blowing my mind. I'm thinking about it right now.
Yeah, but I think that there's something that was evident in these little kind of graphics that were on the phone in Keller's talk that were almost kind of mutant creatures and mutant images that show maybe what happens when you try and force different forms, force these different standards, and force these different resolutions, these different ways of understanding need together when they need to come to an interface, when they need to speak to each other at a certain point, even if it's just enough time to swipe. Something very kind of surreal and almost illegible happens. Which, I mean, kind of, I'm now going to try and open up another space between people, because I think that, in this question of legibility, there was this question of, who are from Ingrid's talk, who are these signs actually written for? And, I mean, you made this kind of offhand comment, which I thought was quite interesting, that, I don't mean to start, to defend transparency here, but there was really this question of who are these marked, who are they for? But I thought it was really inspiring how you went to the boss or the man and you said, "Hi, can you please tell me what this means?" And you kind of asked them for, or at least you said you asked them for a map, right? And they did not give you that map. And I think that there was maybe a similar thing going on in Enrique's talk of kind of understanding the marks of a page, and understanding how to read the networks of power and to read the logistical systems behind this massively transnational and transcontinental service connecting people, connecting thoughts, connecting media from radio to jazz to literature, all kind of around this idea of the sphere of this kind of this impossibly perfect geometry. So I don't know. I wonder. I was really intrigued by this idea of learning how to see, which I think really came up in both of your talks, which I think speaks very very strongly to what Dimensions of Citizenship is doing in a sense by almost forcing us into these 7 scales. As you say, it's a productive constraint, it's a productive restriction, that it also reveals that we need to create new ways of seeing. So I was, and we need to become more attendant to certain conditions and realities of what it means to belong or to be a citizen. And so I don't know. It's maybe more like a request and trying, as I said, to open up a space between this question of legibility, and then maybe if I can with this understanding of sometimes things do fall in the cracks, sometimes things do fall in between resolution standards.
Okay. Thank you. So just to clarify, the boss did not tell me what the markings meant. The trick for understanding kind of like learning how to see networks, literally those kinds of networks, and also I think generally the trick for kind of mapping out a network of power is go ask the person who's kind of at the smallest, kind of most insignificant piece of the node, right? Like I went and talked to people doing street excavation and I was like, what are you doing? And it turns out nobody thanks the person who keeps the internet running. And also I'm, a small, young woman. So like they're willing to chat me up. But I I mean, a similar, I don't know, I think maybe an analogous thing was once being told by somebody who used to do like Oppo research for like a union, like if you want to learn like the real ins and outs of a corporation, you become best friends with all the secretaries, you know? Like you find the person who manages the daybook of all of the managers, right? And it's not quite identical, but I think learning how to get through this cracks is mostly kind of finding the person who like finding the human beings who actually keep the thing running in the ways that are designed to be taken for granted. Also, side note, I just really appreciated the Pynchon as kind of being the next thing discussed in this, because I feel like when I learned how to decode those symbols, I had this total like internal Oedipus moment of just like, ah, yes, they are everywhere.
Laura has the mic there.
Yeah, welcome to my life. So just about the issue of legibility and about what those images that I showed mean. So the rest of the archive is not going to be open until he's died. So the materials that are available at the Ransom Center are all basically correspondence and like first drafts of novels and handwritten ephemera and whatnot that are usually related to his first couple of novels. The reason why the writing of V becomes really important, and I think it's also really important for what we're talking about here, is because basically he was a kind of a global nomad when he was writing it, but also he was one of the first people, one of the first fiction writers to write about concentration camps in Southwest Africa during the Boer War and during the Herero Rebellion. So there was a kind of emphasis on using the craft of writing and communication with colleagues across oceans in other countries, and Baedeker guides, like reading like histories of cities through stuff that had been written less than a century before, but centuries now. But I wanted to redirect this a little bit because on the topic of citizenship, the idea of imposed citizenship, and the idea of the scale of the globe and the implications of the globe. One of the things that I thought about introducing to the table, and it was from my old days as being a practitioner in public and private international law, was the Bogota Declaration of 1976, which basically stated that satellites above the geostationary orbit that are hovering above equatorial countries owe a tax to countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, and whatnot. So, attacks. So basically saying that the satellites that are in geostationary overflight over these countries are citizens of these countries. So that was a little bit of like legal ephemera that I was going to bring to this, but I thought it was a little bit, as a Pynchon isn't esoteric enough, it's like, so.
I would love to grab Shannon and get her in on this, because I think you also are graphically introducing exactly what Nick is describing, the symbolic over the global and that kind of flickering between those two pieces.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I just had a comment also I wanted to add about, I think it was really interesting, this prompt that you gave us of presenting an image alongside the definition, because I think this idea of visualizing the idea of citizenship is also really kind of challenging. So yeah, I'm not sure if I have much more to say actually about how the patterns themselves maybe overlay on the globe, but I think it's also interesting that the globe has come up so frequently as being, there's been quite a few sort of conversations around that particular scale, which I think is really interesting from an American perspective right now too, that there is obviously concern turned inward, but also this reaching out that I think is happening in the discourse. Yeah.
Because I think that there is a lot which you kind of pointed to behind the geometries that you used. We see the globe very rarely as a globe, but we see it as a circle, or for some reason that geometrical term that's escaping my mind, the circle that's not really a circle.
Two-sided polyhedron. Yeah.
No, but. So when I saw this 15-sided figure, I think you're producing an illegibility to it, and it reminded me a bit of Albrecht Dührer's the impossible object in Melancholia, And so I don't know. I think that there is a very strong gesture that you're making towards kind of deconstructing this idea of the globe, of this idea as of a circle, of a round object. And so I think the layers that you're adding on top are certainly one thing, but just the very demarcation of this, I think, is absolutely there. And so, I mean, if I can maybe have, let's say, I'm going to try and bring this back to Laura, and then we can maybe open it up to conversation, because I think that there's something, in this geometric articulation of a globe that's not a globe, of a three-dimensional geometry that can never be seen as in its entirety. I maybe want to go back to this, to these spaces that you found of light and no people, or people and no light. So you're finding these cracks. You're finding these slippages in the way that you, as you said, that things are counted. And so I wonder, kind of in this working. Not even so much with data itself, but rather like structures of data and infrastructures of data. Whether you could speak to maybe this idea of new forms of visibility from within those within or where the resolution doesn't line up, or where there's a mismatch between what we expect to see and what we actually do see.
Yeah, well, these data sets are there to show their own limitations, but they're so much the symbol of how we've come to define global citizenship, right? So the blue marble is the penultimate, right? That penultimate symbol of the unified globe and the vulnerable globe. But when this very same satellite is looking actually to take photographs of fog at night, and by mistake sees night lights, right? And so this data set is highly produced. So it's with no clouds, and it's patched together, and the same as the blue marble, it's spliced together. It's not the same as the looking at the Earth from out of space. So it's in those cracks that we're trying to find ways of seeing what's not there. And it's not, I think your point is really well taken. It's not about transparency. There is no myth of transparency, just like the globe is not this symbol of unification. And so we have to look at these data sets which are used to convince us, right? They're there to create this image of an electrified, connected planet, and all it's showing is actually what's not there. So it's these black spots which look like they're just not on the map, and in fact they're hiding, these huge populations in plain sight. Not that you can see them. Right, so you don't exactly know what it is that you're looking at, and that's what we're trying to expose. I'm not 100% sure what it is yet, but yeah. So
I couldn't help but jump in here because I think the language that you're using, and we're talking at the scale of the black marble, at a planetary scale, it's actually not so different from the language that Amanda Williams and Andres Hernandez are using in their work, Thrival Geographies, which is looking at fugitive space within Black spatial practices, and the way that Black citizens are not being able to get the whole range of citizenship rights, have to use fugitive or hidden or sort of backside ways to migrate themselves through public space. And I think that what's really striking to me on this conversation right now is how we are going, but we're sort of speaking at the same thing at the planetary scale as we're speaking at the citizen scale, or at the very sort of bodily scale, and both sets of them are becoming sort of equivalent in their need to find these kind of breakages and sort of points of revisit. I don't know, is that a word? Like I want to revisible. I'm going to make that one up. Amanda and Andres have put forth a new world from survival to thrival, so they've sort of trademarked. So we'll revisible. And I think some of our interest is actually putting forth some new visions of citizenship as maybe not as necessarily a kind of a utopia. I think that's something that we've actually really shrunk away from, but as a kind of a provocation or as a way to sort of ask that architecture, maybe we'll stick a little bit of architecture back in the conversation, or like a different, just the word, don't mind me. It's been a long day. But sort of this idea that representation, visibility, resolution can sort of begin to empower sort of new sets of understanding. You probably want to say something on that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think as the curatorial team has been able to kind of watch these things at a distance, as Enrique would say, we've kind of been surprised by the themes that emerged, which kind of consistently superseded our framework of 7 scales, which blurred them, which spoke between them. And, I think we often refer to those themes as including questions of ecology, of climate change, of equity and inclusion and race and space. But I think I have a new kind of list of words that emerged tonight that I'm excited and kind of intrigued by, that include loophole, anomaly, interloper, fugitivity, and I'm also thinking of Keller's past writing on piracy, right? And so, I mean, I think we should open this up, and maybe I'll do that with a nod to Enrique's presentation. I think it's, for those of you who have seen the US Pavilion, it is a kind of neo-Jeffersonian mini Monticello. We're going to talk about architecture a little bit. And then there's also kind of so that has an envelope to itself, and then there's the envelope to the U.S. Pavilion. What it means to represent the U.S. is, I think, a always complicated question, and in this moment is especially complicated, right? So those are two kind of envelopes that we're trying to reckon with and bring a kind of a plurality of voices to. And so I love the idea of the envelope as actually just a site for correspondence, for indicating a way to get from one person to another, rather than an envelope, maybe in like a kind of more traditional way we think about in architecture. So I think, I guess on that note, shall we open it up?
Well, okay, so considering there's, all right. Hey everybody, first and foremost, I want to say it was an absolute pleasure to walk into this very hot, stuffy room and enjoy such a discourse. So, Rammer, the gentleman who talked about envelopes, and Ingrid, let's push the envelope. Let's give it a shot. I'm intrigued. This is maybe a comment and a question combined. But if you go back to some of the crisis points in American citizenship, we have to really think about the 14th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote and personhood, but also gave corporations personhood. And so one of the things I'm kind of not hearing, which I'm intrigued by, is if we go from Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. prison industrial system, which is one of the largest in the world, that might be something you guys might want to riff on a little bit, because we're in a mega crisis at the moment with Trump. Even if you go to infrastructure issues and the way that they're kind of looking to privatize and create all sorts of issues around his dismantling of the liberal democratic order that we comfortably call home. I'd love to hear a little bit more on that, because these are very dark, cynical times, and it seems very abstract. What you guys, these are really, really heavy times. So, yeah, just wanted to put that out there. And I think I'm the only black person here, by the way. But interesting. Hey. Oh, there's one more. Oh, on the screen. On the screen. Hi, Mr. On the screen. Hello. All right.
I have a thought, and I think I've been incredibly inspired by the work that, I mean, because you bring up the question of race, because you bring up the question of the prison industrial complex, I think we've all been really inspired by the work that Amanda Williams and Andres Hernandez have been doing for the Pavilion. And I think I mentioned that they are inspired by the historical figures of Harriet Jacobs and Harriet Tubman, right? So I think they're pointing to the way, for example, Harriet Jacobs hid in the rafters of a home to save her life and her daughter's life, and Harriet Tubman, of course, with the Underground Railroad, a series of safe houses and coded signals. But that these can be read as kind of not just spatial practice, but kind of tactics of fugitivity that we that can be ultimately kind of like liberatory for marginalized people of overall. And I think that's kind of an inclusive and optimistic project, and it's something that I am inspired by. And I think that their project asks us and challenges us in a kind of uncomfortable way to deal with some of the kind of really the kind of like difficult issues of whose body is and isn't included, and kind of questions of citizenship, and asks us not to take for granted the idea that citizenship is granted to all people, of course. And I think that kind of came up a lot in your question of insurgency. So I think, I don't think that answers the question, but I think that's a work that starts to kind of interrogate some of those themes, and one that I've been inspired by, and I think also can kind of speak to broader scales as well in the end.
I think we will all agree that these are dark times. That your question around the prison industrial complex is on the nose, and I think Suk-Jung brought it up around the question of architects who might design prisons and like their implications, and even the AIA being very slow to come out against that, and the human rights and conditions embedded in AIA contracting. And I think these are all really important issues and things that I often write about in my own criticism. I think in sense of the Pavilion, ever feel a little overwhelmed by all the issues? And this is not to say that we're, sort of excusing ourselves, but I think what we're hoping to do is create enough platforms around these 7 participants, and then the 7 written works that sort of respond into each of those scales, to at least get some of these questions aired, even if they're not necessarily answered. So I think that I apologize, because I also feel like that's a little bit of a hedge, and that hedging is something that I think we feel uncomfortable with. I think we would rather answer it more straight on. But I would also agree with Anne that there is a certain sense of, and this came up earlier today, we had a question around, is this a very American? What is it about this grouping of ideas that reflects America? And my answer was around optimism, and I think that optimism, that even though we are faced with sort of structural conditions that are extremely difficult, that there is the possibility for design and architecture as having an agency, that architects have agency to begin to move this conversation in whatever small way. So that is my sort of longish hedge around a very important question.
Thinking about these dimensions of citizenship spatially, to my mind, it brings up the question of thresholds and how we navigate different kinds of thresholds physically. So there's, of course, the airport, there's different kinds of vehicles, there's actual walls, there's certain kind of landscapes that function as thresholds or borders. And also in cities, Keller mentioned these kind of zones that might be activated for different kinds of passing through a citizenship. And this image is obviously also a kind of threshold, or so I'm kind of wondering if maybe that's also something you look at, because it kind of ties it back to architecture also.
Yeah, I think actually questions of threshold and transgression of threshold is something that not only do we feel like many of the projects are dealing with, but specifically this set of films that we're looking at are about threshold. I'm thinking of Mika Rottenberg's Cosmic am I going to get this right, reactor, which is about a magical realist tunneled between Mexico and a set of Chinese restaurants on the other side of the border in the Mexicali border, and a very sort of stylized way of sort of envisioning this threshold. And so that's one example. Or dark fiber, which is the pulling of dark fiber cable out of the ocean across a landscape, down railroad tracks, into a building and plugging it in. And so how do we begin to illustrate thresholds, which is kind of the fleeting idea, through these imageries which are about things that aren't sort of as bounded as a scale or a globe, but are about this sort of movement which the threshold makes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me also, since we have on stage like our teams talking about networks and the globe as kind of a series of nodes or kind of constructed representations, I think that the idea of the threshold or the kind of binary of inside or outside or an edge condition is something we're also really trying to complicate in the pavilion, and something that many of our exhibitors are trying to make more blurry, right? So even at the scale of the nation, right? Specifically, Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman are looking at a border region. And I think that's a kind of project overall that we've been really interested in trying to kind of make more complex the kind of communities that we're part of, and whether that expands to kind of ecological communities in the case of the work of Scape, or kind of communities that we choose to join through kind of more cosmopolitan practices in Keller's work. I think that the kind of sense of threshold is a term that we're really looking to complicate in the kind of formal questions of citizenship.
I'm just going to tack on a real small piece. I also think that there is a sort of a blurring of threshold. There's a very interdisciplinary drive within this project. And if we just sort of look at the people who are up here right now, we see, designers, architects, graphic designers, writers, from all different sort of disciplines, sort of coming together around this one issue. And I think that is sort of part of that sort of making strange of what we consider sort of the borderline of architecture.
Oh, and you have a question.
No, I'm just holding the microphone. Hi, forgive me if I missed this, but my question is more about praxis. And so how we do this rather than what are we doing? And to counter perhaps the question from before about crisis, on the contrary, I feel like many of the issues we touched on today are actually responsive to crisis, and I feel like many people would share my view when I say I cannot remember a time without one. So I guess I wonder, what is this event, if there is maybe a room within this event in which we can address the decades of cultural diplomacy that left many of the artists and countries completely locked up in a nationalist context in which the production has to be attached to a country. So even when someone who is not from US has to speak about Ukraine or Rwanda, in order to make it into biennial, they have to enter through a very specific path. And would this event not be an ideal space to recreate the kind of stateless pavilion, again, for artists like NSK has proposed years ago? And is this something that you have considered? And if so, where did it took you? Thank you.
I saw the NSK on the door as we walked in.
Yeah.
So
Oh, no, I was thinking about it longer than
I don't know, maybe.
I mean, it may be still to be determined, but the many projects certainly was wanting not to be in the pavilion, but to be distributed throughout. I mean, it's the sort of absurdity of these national pavilions in this alley, on this alley if there was an incident a few years ago where I think the Spanish pavilion wanted to store some chairs in the Swiss pavilion or something, and it was like an international incident or something. So there was some talk, and maybe we still can do this, of kind of atomizing the presence of something in other pavilions. But it is reflected in some way in the, in what Laura's talking about, in this kind of lumpy world that you're showing, that at least for me there is, I think about a kind of, while there's the data and so on, what I really think about is a kind of heavy information system of lumpy resistant things that are, they're spatial and they are, not contained in this pavilion.
Multiple projects within this pavilion, which, yes, we are wearing sort of the hat of the nationality as we say this, are proposing things like a mobile cosmopolitanism, or Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman's cross-border citizen or a trans-border region. So I think maybe there is an ultimate sort of lingering goal to maybe go post-nation or even sort of post-citizen in that. And I think certainly those ideas are surfacing. Whether or not there is a plan for a stateless pavilion, I invite you to come stage one.
Maybe we can make it transversal, because otherwise they stateless, half of the room goes, no.
Exactly. We could act it out right now.
I'm actually stateless up until 2007 once, so great.
Wasn't there a Biennale where there was an art Biennale where everybody occupied other people's pavilion? Which year was it? No, just last year? No, it was a few years ago. It was like 10 years ago. It was the art Biennale, not the architecture. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. Yeah.
Actually, at the risk of sort of provocation, I enjoyed the panel. I didn't want to be mischaracterized as being a negative at it.
Yeah.
So, you were mentioning about stateless and so on. I hope I wasn't mischaracterized as being in a negative about the panel. I just feel that when you said there is no crisis or there's always a crisis, one could argue we're in the middle of a sixth extinction, as many anthropologists and also seismologists and so on are looking at massive die-off of a huge amount of species, and there's a tremendous amount of issues around climate change. The only place on Earth with no government is Antarctica. So I invite you maybe to check that out. But the issue here, when we're talking about citizenship, is there's a crisis in the American narrative that's actually being effective globally. So that's where, and I'm in support of many of the panelists. I enjoy what they're saying. I'm just wanted to say that the American issue is hyper connected to pretty much almost all aspects. So, yeah. So please don't mischaracterize me on that. Thanks, though.
You don't need to apologize. Yeah, I think it's really hard to know nowadays where activism should take place first, right? I mean, I think we're all. I don't think any of us have resolved what the Trump administration is going to mean long term, and the incarceration rates went way up because of a lot of things that Bill Clinton did. And we have to remember, that. Like, these things didn't just suddenly change in 2016. So, so I'm uncomfortable responding directly right now to predictions of the Trump administration. It's such a unknowable territory. Which is not to say that there aren't many problems and many things that have been going on all along, which we all should be activists about, every single day. So, I mean, that's how I see it more as a continuum. That, in fact, perhaps we shouldn't be so shocked, and we should have known all along I don't know, I question myself about that every day. Like, I feel like I need to learn, I need to relearn and learn new things every day to respond to the next, to the next few months. I don't know.
Can we take one more?
I just have one comment to the to the issue of the carceral archipelago, as the term is sometimes used. When I've taught studio in the past in Indiana, one of the sites that we go visit is a supermax prison near the Southwest Illinois Indiana border, which is where Timothy McVeigh is being incarcerated at the moment. So there is interest in, at least the architecture school where I teach at the moment, there is interest in kind of investigating the spatial ramifications of these kinds of these conditions where people are stripped of rights by legal instrument or by by some kind of other act, right? So again, but that just speaks to the larger issue. It's like, what is the role of the pavilion in this, right? It's like, what is the speed that a pavilion is supposed to operate at? What is the speed that discourse is supposed to operate? What is the speed of the discipline, right? And what is the speed of the profession, right? We're talking about different things that operate at different speeds, and they may encroach on different things at different times. So it's as Laura was saying, it's like it's not to be determined, but maybe it's in progress, right? So.
And Enrique and I talk about lateness quite a bit. So maybe to bring in an example for one of the participants that we haven't talked about yet, which is Studio Gang's work in Memphis. They're looking at a site along the Mississippi River called Cobblestone Landing. It was a site where the cotton industry and as such, also the slave industry would dock. And these series of cobblestones on this site date back to the late 1800s. They are also sort of looking at recent acts of citizen activism, which is combined with city government, has removed 2 Jim Crow era Confederate statues from the city of Memphis. And in looking at these 2 pieces, they are hoping to redefine, by speaking with a very large range of people within Memphis, a more inclusive public monument of sorts, a kind of spatial condition or a public space that acknowledges these kinds of fraught histories, that sort of allows the kind of latency of the material of the stone to carry through, and then amplifies both voices and these stones, which also carry a myth of being the ballasts in slave ships. So even though they can't seem to prove that, but it's part of this history. And I think maybe in this sense, time, right, is of all of these crises begins to add up, and then we begin to accumulate them, and we see incremental movements towards change through that. And I think the Studio Gang projects, the Stone Stories, is a really great example of how we might sort of make these efforts.
So my question focuses around the city's role in citizenship. From my understanding, like, one of the greatest migrations of the 21st century will be urbanization, and so the city is going to take a pronounced role in the way that citizens' rights are distributed and recognized, and especially even right now, where New York is looking to not reverse, but to mitigate like net neutrality votes on the federal level. So I'm wondering about how cities can sort of create citizenships in the way that they can become sanctuary cities, and the way that they can subvert on the federal level a more humane approach to welcoming in migrants and refugees and immigrants.
I mean, I can maybe respond to that indirectly, and I don't mean to kind of speak on behalf of the curatorial team, but I think what's being exposed now, not just because of the massive migrations that are taking place from the countryside into cities, but also because of the pressures that are being placed on basic liberties, and these crises that that we seem to only be going through more than we have in the past. It reveals a history and a weird kind of structure and a weird form to maybe even you could say the nation state as such, is that the nation state is a scalar operation. I don't want to use the term stack, but I will. There are these different layers, and I think that the city has a distinct set of powers and responsibilities that are encoded in state constitutions and in federal constitutions. And I think if we're looking if there is an idea that there is spaces of resistance, of even freedom, as fraught as that term is, within the spaces that are either that get overcoded by too many systems and become illegible, or things that become, unresolvable, unrenderable. It's exactly in the scalar differences between, exactly what the power of the city is, what the power of the state is, what the power of the federal government is. I think it's, at least personally speaking, I think it's now more than ever is exactly when, we need to know what the powers of different scales are, because it's in that we can fight. So. Yeah, I mean, I feel a bit bad being the last voice, but I mean, on that note, it is a bit late, and I think we do have some wine in the back, and some books if you guys want to fill your minds up even more. Thank you, everyone who has stayed for this entire event. Thank you, all the participants.